Hello everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, the jury, online, wherever you may be, I say good evening, good morning, good afternoon. The magic of technology, we could be speaking here and be heard everywhere and viewed as well. So tonight's topic is, do you work to live or do you live to work? Business and soul. And the connection is related to this week's Torah chapter. As I've mentioned many times, that there are 52 chapters in the Torah corresponding to the 52 weeks of the year. Each chapter has 7 sections corresponding to each day of the week. In effect, we have for every day a corresponding section of the Torah, being that the Torah is a blueprint for life. Torah comes from the word Hera, which means directive, guide, guidance. Think of it like life's operator's manual. So the Torah covers the spectrum of all time and space. And this week's chapter, BeHar, which is the next to last chapter in the book of Leviticus, as we shall soon discuss, talks about this big challenge, which today perhaps more than ever plagues us, the issue of our work, our identity, what are we identified by? So, when you ask most people, who are you? They give you their business card. The question I ask all of you is that what you do as well? Remember, your business card is not who you are, it's what you do. But it just captures the phenomenon that we identify by ourselves by what we do. And we know much less about who we are than by what we do. Which, of course, begs the question, what is our true identity? And it's obvious, it's natural why we do that, because if we're immersed, consumed, most of the day with our work, and most of our lives with work, so at some point this becomes our identity, which is really a sad commentary on the human condition, because just like our work, there are all kinds of other forces that are not necessarily who we are, but these are the masks we wear, and then we become our masks. For example, money itself. Many people define their self-worth by their net worth. Many people define themselves by looks, by the way they project appearances, the package. The sizzle becomes more important than the steak. So what happens is that our inner personalities of who we really are and our potential and all that we're capable of gets buried under the surface of whatever it is that we're projecting. So this is a topic that is as relevant today as ever, but it's always been an issue because we have definitely 2 dimensions to ourselves, if not more, but at least 2, the outer you and the inner you. The outer you is the one, as I said, that you project, that people see. And the inner you, who you would be if you were not answering to anybody, if you did not have to live up to anybody's expectations, if you did not have any commitments, if you did not need to please anybody. What would we really be like? So this is the topic I want to address. And it's interesting, as I said, thousands of years ago, the Torah, this week's chapter, discusses directly this topic. And if you know the parsha, you may wonder where. Well, it's not even an obscure place. It's right at the beginning of the chapter. The chapter opens up and says that God speaks to Moses at Mount Sinai and says the following. Speak to the children of Israel and tell them. You shall tell them, when you will come to the land that I'm going to give you, that I'm giving you, this means the promised land, Israel. So you shall proclaim V'shav sa'aret Shabbos la'Hashem. You shall, let's see the translation they say here. The land shall rest a Sabbath to God. And then he continues and says, 6 years shall you sow the fields and prune your vineyards and gather in its produce. But in the 7th year you shall rest the land for God, Shabbos to God. Shabbos to Hashem, right. And then he goes on to some more of the details. This, of course, is the mitzvah of the sabbatical. We call it Shemitah. That every 7th year, the command is to rest the fields, which exists today as well, only in Israel, obviously. You go to Israel, see in the 7th year, there's special laws of not eating from the land. The lands are sold, or different type of laws that define this mitzvah. The Sefer HaChinuch, the great codifier of the Middle Ages, explains one of the reasons for this mitzvah is to remind ourselves that we're not self-made creatures, that our fields and our vineyards and our work is based on a blessing of God's. And the Shabbos reminds us that we should remember that there's a higher force than just your work. He also brings an interesting thing, which I don't know if it's corroborated by modern agricultural science, that just like a human being, a machine has to rest at times, the land too, by not sowing it and not planting it, etc., that land in a way has ability to regenerate. And it's healthy for the land every 7 years to rest it. So I said I would love to corroborate. If anybody has any information on that, please submit it and tell us. Let me know. But going back to this chapter, to this mitzvah, so the mitzvah is a simple mitzvah. It's similar to the mitzvah of Shabbos. 6 days you shall work, 7th day you shall rest. 6 years you shall work the fields, and the 7th year it shall rest. So it has many similarities. Obviously the Shemitah year doesn't have the strict laws of a Shabbat of the week, the prohibition not work altogether. It's just not working the fields. And that's another discussion, the difference between the Shabbat of the year and the Shabbat of the week. But they have essentially the same principle. Principle is that you are not defined by the work you do. You're defined by the spiritual Shabbat that the work leads you to. So right here, you have very clear that yes, we may be working 6 years of the cycle, or 6 days of the week. But remember that the focus, the purpose, that's a means to come to Shabbos God. But here's the question that the Alter Rebbe poses. There seems to be a redundancy. If he should have said, when you will come to the land, 6 years you shall sow the fields and prune the vineyards, and the 7th year shall be Shabbos. Why does he begin by saying you'll come to the land, you shall rest the land Shabbos? And then he goes back and says again 6 years, and again says after 6 years the 7th year. It would have been what would be missing if he just spoke in the sequence of 6 years and then Shabbos. Why do you need to bring a Shabbos before you talk about the 6 years? Because the fact is, they first needed 6 years of working before the Shabbos comes. And the answer he gives is also quite simple but also profound. And that is because in any given endeavor, you always begin with the purpose. You don't begin with a process. You begin, what is the purpose of coming to this land? What is the purpose of the work? So even before you start working, he states, the first thing you should know, even before you begin to sow the fields or do any of your work, know that the purpose of all of this is to have Shabbos LaHashem. And then the verse continues and says, and what's the actual time sequence for this? The actual process is that 6 years you work, and the 7th year you rest. So the Rishav Saaretz is like stating the mission statement before you even begin the work. Now, if you ask yourself the question, what really does that add? You could say, tell the 6 days, 6 years, and then you come to the purpose. Well, it adds the focus that even before you do one stitch of work, you know why you're doing it. And you don't have to wait for 6 years to find out. So there's actually an interesting two opinions. The Shammai and Hillel in the Talmud disagree about many matters. Actually, their students disagree about many matters, but it originated from Shammai and Hillel, two colleagues. Shammai generally being more strict, and Hillel being more lenient, even though there are exceptions. So they have also a disagreement about Shabbos and the weekdays. There's a mitzvah that says you shall remember Shabbos. So the Ramban, Nachmanides, writes that this mitzvah is not on Shabbos itself. You don't need to be told on Shabbos to remember Shabbos. The mitzvah is that 6 days of the week you shall remember Shabbos. That you have to always remember Shabbos because it's the purpose of existence. So here's the difference. So both Shammai and Hillel, through the week, knew that there was a Shabbos coming, but Shammai actually, if he found a beautiful piece of food, a mana yafa is the expression, he found a nice loaf of bread, or mana, maybe bread wouldn't last, but something that was a beautiful food, he would not eat it on Sunday or Monday or any time of the week. He would hold it and preserve it for Shabbos. Hillel, on the other hand, his method was every day God blesses you, and you have to and receive those blessings. On Friday, you prepare for Shabbos. So the question is, what's the difference between the two? They both obviously observed Shabbos. They both knew throughout the week that the purpose of life is not work but Shabbos. Well, Shammai was more strict in the sense where he actually did something every day, essentially fused every day with the Shabbos experience. And Hillel felt that you thank God for what you have in the weekdays, and then when it comes Shabbos, that's when you do. But there has to be some deeper meaning in this disagreement, or these two different customs. So let's go back to the actual topic at hand, and that is what exactly Shabbos means, what exactly Shemitah means, and in context of our discussion here. And that is the following. Going back to the identity issue. It says in the Torah, it says that 6 days God created the world, and the seventh day He rested. So the obvious question is, was God got tired? If He needed rest, why did He wait 6 days? Why didn't He rest after 1 day, 2 days? So clearly the resting of God is not literal. It's just a manner of expression. So the word in the Torah is Vayechulu Hashamayim, or that on the seventh day God Vayechulu. So if you're in the English translation, they will say rest, but it's not an accurate translation. It really means God returned to the source. So think of it like this, just to use an example. Someone lives in a palace, a king lives in a great palace, and then he wants to achieve something, wants to go accomplish something outside of the palace. So he goes outside of the palace and does the mundane work, or whatever it may be. That's not his natural place. It's not his natural habitat. So and then he comes back home. That would be the Shabbat experience. So what was going on here is like this: that the divine essence, the way Chassidus explains it, is beyond all of existence. It's beyond immersing itself in the structure of existence. However, God had a purpose and wanted to create a material world for us to transform it into a spiritual home. So in a sense, God not physically went out of Himself, but so-called spiritually manifested Himself in a state that is unnatural to divine revelation. Basically, the Tzimtzum, He hid His presence, concealed Himself, and created a new state of consciousness, which would be the world in which we inhabit. Now, Kabbalah and Chassidus talk about a whole series called Seder Shtalshus, a cosmic order, step after step after step. So yes, it's all God's creation, but if you look at the universe, you don't see it as a reflection of the divine initially. We need to work, we need to contemplate. And we can even say no. There are people who consider themselves atheists or agnostics. God created an agnostic world that you can easily say, it's all about me. Who says there's a God altogether? That's how distant it is, so-called, from divine consciousness. In truth, it's just a concealment. That's the 6 days of the week. And why is 6? Because there was the 6 reflect the 6 emotions. Chesed, Gvura, Teferet, Netzach, Chayid, Yisayid. 6 emotions, which is a manifestation of the divine. And then when you conceal it, concealment after concealment, you end up with a world that can deny its creator. This would mean that God went out of His natural habitat and manifested Himself in a universe that conceals His presence. It would be, think of it like you, let's say you created a particular machine, and then you dressed yourself up in so many garments that the machine cannot recognize its own engineer, its own creator. And then you appear, and no one recognizes you because they're completely concealed in many garments. This is the analogy that Kabbalah and Chassidus give to understand how existence is. So we call the nature of the universe in Hebrew Teva. Teva means nature. So it says in the Kabbalists, right, that Ha-Teva, the nature, is the gematria of the name Elokim. So Elokim refers to the divine manifestation that conceals itself in a form of constriction, the tzimtzum. Why? Because when you look at the world, you could call it all nature. It's an act of nature. The Alter Rebbe says in Tanya that nature really is just simply a word we use when we have nothing we can't explain a phenomenon. We call it's the nature of the thing. What does that mean? When someone says nature, what makes it? How does that help us? And nature is an easy way to just replace nature. You could say it's an act of nature. You could say it's an act of God. In insurance policies, as I've often pointed out, they write acts of God. So I once asked a lawyer why. Right? Why acts of God? Because their reasoning is if you write acts of nature, they can leave an opening for a claim. Who says that the insurance company is not liable for the act of nature? But if it's an act of God, then God is responsible. So suddenly God is relevant when it comes to saving a few dollars. But all insurance policies they'll say a hurricane or other acts of God. Why don't they write acts of nature? This is what that lawyer told me. Because nature would leave it open. You could say, you know what? Why am I responsible for Hurricane Sandy? Maybe you should be responsible. But if it's God, so God is the scapegoat here. But regardless of that, nature is basically another word from the word teva in Hebrew also means submerged. And the reason for that is, imagine when you throw an object into the sea. It suddenly disappears. You don't even know it's there. As a matter of fact, if we didn't have cameras and we never went underwater, we would never know how complex the ecosystem of the undersea world is like. Today we know it's even more complex than all life on Earth. First of all, it's larger. 2/3 of the world is covered by water. Secondly, it's deeper. Everything that exists on land exists in water, the Talmud says. It doesn't say the reverse. You'll find in the water we find species, sea cucumbers and sea lions and sea horses and so on. And there are species in the water that do not exist on land, not even anything similar. There are more species in the water than there are on land. So we never know this. If you look at the surface of the sea, once in a while you see a fish, a fin, etc. But you would never know that. You'd think, okay, there's a few fish in the sea. Suddenly it opens up the world. So the sea is a perfect example of teva. That's teva. You look on the surface of existence, you can convince yourself there's nothing under the surface. Today we know through modern science and physics and so on that the world is made up of molecules, and molecules are made up of atoms, and atoms are made up of subatomic particles. Human beings. You look at a human body. You'd never guess that there's a thing called cells or DNA or genes or chromosomes. Those were discoveries. You see that, so you see a person has a face, body, legs, other organs and limbs. Now we know there's a whole system beneath the surface, which is far more complicated than anything on the surface level. So teva essentially means submerged. That all that's within is submerged to the point that on the surface you can convince yourself there's nothing going on. So this is how God created the universe. He manifested what the way the Kabbalists put it in the 6 midot, in the 6 faculties called Chesed, Gvura, Tiferet. So then it's still divine faculties. The faculty Sunday is divine kindness. Monday is divine severity or discipline. Tuesday is divine compassion. But then he continued to add layers and layers of garments and concealments to the point where we have a universe. We're born into this world, and we see a beautiful universe. When you think about it, you say, "Hey, did this create itself?" Just like a book testifies to its author, and a music testifies to its composer, and a building testifies to an architect. Why would the beautiful world that we live in, with all the design, which is far more intricate, far more complicated, not testify to a creator? But notwithstanding that, why people deny it is because it's so submerged, and that it's easy to be able to dismiss that there's anything beneath the surface. Okay, but then when you start thinking about it, you say there must be some force behind it. What keeps it? What this type of synchronicity, and this type of symmetry, and all the beauty, as I said, the harmony. Same with the human body. Everything's so coordinated, and so on. So on the surface level, what God created were the 6 emotions, 6 days of the week. But Shabbos comes a day Shabbos and says, okay, 6 days have passed. This is what I created because I want you to come to discover the truth beneath the surface. But on Shabbos, I return back to my natural palace. That's what happens. Natural palace is a place where the divine dominates, divine consciousness. And therefore, God said, and therefore you should also have 6 days of the week you shall work, as we read in the 10 Commandments. 6 days of the week, go outside of your own self and involve yourself in the work you do, in the world, in the mundane world. But 7th day, and the same thing in the 7th year, remember where you come from. Remember that your purpose, the reason for all this is not the work. The reason for all this is you come from a place that is far more sublime, And this is just an external expression of yourself. That's what Shabbos is. Return home, basically. So 6 days a week we leave home in a psychological and emotional, spiritual sense. And on Shabbos we return home. So some people will say, one second, I don't feel on Shabbos any closer to God than I feel on Friday or Thursday. Well, that's because we become creatures of this world and we're not sensitive. But if you open yourself up, the energy of Shabbos is a far less materialistic energy. So think of it like there's all these layers, and Shabbos the layers are somewhat removed. And that's why it's not like you're not allowed to do this work on Shabbos. You don't need to do it. You don't need to go there. Because it's, as a matter of fact, it's like going outside of yourself on a day when you should be going inside yourself. So there are times when we involve ourselves in outside activities. There are times we do inner work, our own inner spiritual work. Think of it this way. Another way to look at it. What stimulates us most? On a very basic level, it's our senses. The things we see, hear, taste, touch, and smell consume our lives. Just to the extent we don't even notice it. You walk down the street, your eyes are watching things, you're hearing sounds, you're smelling things, you're tasting and touching. And that's how we define this as a sensory experiences. What would happen if we shut down our senses and you close your eyes and your ears, your taste, touch, and smell? So initially the thought can be terrifying. You may disappear. You won't disappear. Because you don't need eyes, ears, taste, touch, and smell to experience yourself. These are experiences outside of you. You need eyes to see someone else. You don't need eyes to see yourself. You need ears to hear someone else. The same with taste, touch, and smell. These are channels, you can call them like bridges, that connect us to the outside world or the world of other people. But if you're on your own, if you actually shut off your senses, you know what will emerge? The real you. What you are, independent of the stimulation that is projected by you and by others around you. That's an example. 6 days of the work, immerse in the sensory experience, and get involved in producing something and creating something, whatever work a person does. And on Shabbos, return to a place that's suprasensory. Basically going from the material physical world into the spiritual realm. Now obviously we still are physical creatures on Shabbos, and the same thing on Shemitah. So we're still physical souls inside of bodies, but we try to minimize as much as we can our material creation. That's why the Lamates, the 13 the types of work that are prohibited on Shabbos, are all about creating something, about shaping something. So we avoid doing any of that in order to return back into our inner selves, our soul. And most of the work on Shabbos should be soulful, but it should also permeate our material world. That's why we eat a meal. We eat 3 meals, and the pleasure we have from physical meal, even from physical sleep, becomes part of the mitzvah of Shabbos. So it's not about denying the material world. We're not talking about asceticism. It's about focusing on realizing that the material world is just a surface level of an inner world. So Shabbos isn't about Yom Kippur, for example, fasting and denying material world, even to the farthest extent. Shabbos, we don't do that. We just avoid the creation of things, the shaping of things, all that those 39 types of work symbolize. And we go back to the so-called soulful place to recognize the soul within the body. Again, the soul within the body. And the same thing with Shemitah, the sabbatical year. 6 years you shall plant the field, prune the vineyards. And the 7th year is a year we should focus on not the work, but the purpose of it all. To elevate it all. The Shabbos La Hashem that the 7th year represents. Which is why it says in holy books that on the 7th year, in the sabbatical, many people who worked in the fields in the olden days, with that year was like a sabbatical year. They spent more time studying Torah, praying more, because they had more time on their hands. But it was more than that. It was going back to the purpose of it all. So the interesting irony is this. If the purpose of it all is Shabbos, why don't we have 6 days Shabbos and 1 day work day? Because, which some people would enjoy, because the purpose is to transform the world. The purpose is not to just enter the Shabbos experience. So you have once a week, 1/7 of the week to remind us of the purpose. But the bottom line, that's no achievement to live on a Shabbos level all week long. The achievement is to live in a material world and not forget and remember what the purpose of it all is. But what happens is the material world hijacks us. And hence we will show someone our business card when you're asked who you are, instead of focusing on really who you are. And the obvious reason, as I said before, is because we're immersed in it so much. So it becomes our identity. But a second important reason is because that's how we were educated. Many of us were never told that you have a soul. So how do we identify ourselves? By what we see, by what stimulates us, by instant gratification, by the immediate physical, material world which we see around us. If someone told us beneath this there's a whole layer of energy, just like beneath the sea there's a whole world, it's a different way of looking at things. We're really not told. Once in a while we may hear about it, but we're not trained to think that way. When we become adults and we start looking for a higher purpose, then we start saying, hey, there must be something behind this, behind the curtain. But it's not something that's so naturally taught to most of us. As a matter of fact, we're taught to indulge and master the surface level of life. So to the point that we don't think about that, the whole purpose of life is not material existence, it's to reveal the spiritual within the material. And that's why the Torah begins, V'shav Saaretz, as soon as you come to the land, before you begin one stitch of work, even before the first day of work, right away, never forget that before you enter the work, remember there's a higher reality called Shabbos, L'Hashem, a spiritual reality beneath it all, and now begin working. And then afterwards you actually will keep the Shabbos, the sabbatical year. But it's critical, your consciousness should be your head should be in the right place. Which explains a very fundamental question. And that is, if God wanted to create us as adults, why didn't we just pop out of our mother's womb as 20-year-old adults, 25-year-old adults? Why do we need to go through the whole process of childhood and being vulnerable and defenseless and having people watch over us and protect us? All the hassle that comes with that. Why not just create adults? Science won't ask this question because science takes the reality and that's how it is. But the Torah asks such a question. Why? Because God created it all. He could have created it a different way. Simple as that. Science can't make that statement. Science says we come to understand the creation as it is. We've studied the phenomenon. But why is it that way? Now, I understand it makes sense that everything progresses. It's a much more natural thing that you're not just only 25 years old. But still, what's the logic behind it all? And one of the answers for this is, besides the obvious answer that, yes, God wants it to be in a progressive way, that you grow into an adult, you don't just become an adult. I should add to the question, by the way, that Adam and Eve, it says in Medrash, were created as 20 years old. When they were created, they were not children. They were 20-year-old adults already. On that Friday, the first day of creation. So why not do it with everyone? So besides the obvious answer, which is God wanted a progression that a person learns and works their way up. You don't suddenly become an adult. You have to work at it. You get educated. But there's still a deeper reason, because you could ask that question as well. You could say, give them 25 years. And it's not 25. When you're 25, you have everything you need, and you grow from there. But you're already a mature adult. The reason is because we want to have a stage that's earlier before we enter into the material world. And the childhood years, from birth through adulthood, is preparing us. It's like the Shabbos that precedes the work. If we were immersed and thrown into the world, we were born, and within a few minutes or a few hours, like some animals, just really go right into the world, we would not be able to have the energy and the resources to sublimate the world, because we would immediately be thrust into a hostile world and without the tools. Even with a whole childhood, it's so difficult. Comes childhood, which is the beauty of childhood, of innocence, someone else providing for you. You can spend your time studying, praying, developing your talents. You have the peace of not having to deal with the struggles of a material life. So those years are not just unnecessary. They actually prepare you, like the Shabbos that precedes the Shav Sar Shabbos L'Hashem. Because if you think about a child's life, it's like a Shabbos life, relatively speaking. Why? Because as I said, a child doesn't have to work. Thank God. In healthy situations. Provided for. And a child can be focused on their own personal development. Spiritual development. Unfortunately, education today is lacking some of that spiritual side. So we train our children to be like us, like adults. So it's basically a training of becoming a materially successful person. That's a tragedy. The whole point of childhood, and that's why we begin as children, not as adults, is to prepare us spiritually. So we should be able to look at the world not as a material world, but as a world that is concealing a whole spiritual reality. Be able to look at ourselves. So if education was done right, the early years, the formative years, we would be taught. Your identity is your soul, not your business card. Your identity is not what you're going to do in your life. It's going to be who you are. And it should work the other way around. First, who you are should define what you do, not what you do should define who you are. But, as I said, in most cases, and we see it all the time, when you ask most people what is their identity is usually a sum total of the parts of their life activities. Their job, maybe their family, their achievements, their outside, external accomplishments. Where in truth, if you just think logically, what should identify a person? Should it be the circumstances around you that identify who you are, or who you are should define your circumstances? But we are victims of circumstances, product of circumstances. Because no one taught us, at least most of us, that it begins from within. Now, when I say it, it seems so obvious. Everyone knows that if you want to get to the bottom of anything, you have to begin with the personality of that entity, and then you figure out how. Like they say in design or marketing, form follows function. So if you go, for example, to a graphic designer, or you go to a marketing consultant, or you go to anyone that's going to do a campaign for you in any possible way, so or they develop a website for you, the first thing they'll ask you, what's the soul of your organization, of your company? They're not going to start coming with designs, they'll say, based on their impression. They want to know from the guts, from the inside, what do you represent? What is your function? Tell me your function, then I'll create a form around it. Imagine it be the opposite. You go to a great artist and they come back and say, here's a great logo. You say, one second, but that logo doesn't fit my mission. So change your mission. They say, Groucho Marx said once, I have my set of principles, very firmly. And then he looks around sheepishly and says, and if you don't like them, I have another set. That often is what happens. We become very mercurial, and our values become very arbitrary and changing based on what people expect. Think about how many times have you changed your position because people didn't like it. Why? Because you're working from the outside in instead of from the inside out. What is a self-confident human being? Ultimately, someone who knows very clearly who they are, is confident of that, and then figures out how to express that. And if someone doesn't like it, so either they'll be diplomatic and find a way to express it, but they're not going to change who they are because someone doesn't like it. But let's be honest, we live in a world of conformity. We live in a world where we want to be accepted. We want to please. We're pleasers. And many of us don't have that strength of character and identity to say, this is who I am. Yeah, many of us may have pride, we may have egos. That's not what I'm talking about. Ego, pride, arrogance is not a sign of knowing what you want. That's just a sign of maybe fighting for your turf. A really secure person works from the inside out. They find out what the function is, form, and then they look to the function. First you start with the what, then the how. You don't say, how are we going to do it? First, what do you want to do? You want to do this, then it's one type of how. You want to do that, it's a different type of how. And I can give 100 examples where we make these mistakes all the time. As a speaker, I'm invited very often to speak places. So I ask the host says, so what do you want to speak about? Or what are you used to speaking about? So, I have a list of topics I've spoken. I always say the same thing. I say, it depends what your audience wants to hear. I don't mean the message, what topic they want to hear. For example, if an audience is like a certain young age where they're interested right now in relationships, well, you're not going to talk to them about retirement, right? It's like they say that you have to have, there was a chassid who was blessed by a Rebbe, by the previous Chabad Rebbe, that he should always know what to say in the right time and the right place. And they asked him, what does that mean? So he said, to say to somebody good morning at night is not in the right time. To say to somebody good morning while they're sitting in the bathroom is not the right place. So it's about, you have to know the what before you know the how. So I say, find out from your community what they may be interested in, what topics are bothering them. And very often, I know it may sound shocking, but many people, hosts who know their community, don't even think of it. They say, that's a good idea. I say, go to the people who may be coming. I'm not living in your city. I don't know what's going on. Obviously, if you leave it up to me, I'll try to find something relevant. There's always relationships, pain and suffering. Then the top 10, the top 2 topics that I can tell you is always, number 1 is love, marriage, sexuality, intimacy, relationships. That's 1. And number 2 is pain and suffering. I once told this to a program director, and they said, that's not 2 topics, it's the same topic. That's another discussion. My point is, of course you can find, but it's always healthier to know what. And then you say, okay, how are we going to achieve that? And my next question I always tell the hosts is, what do you want to accomplish? What do you want people to go home with? And again, they always, people look many times at me strangely. They say, well, what do you mean? You know what to do. I said, no, what do you want? Do you want them to go home and write you a check? Do you want them to go home and start keeping Shabbos? Do you want them to go home and come to a class? You want them to, there's so many things that they could be doing. So usually they say, all the above. Okay, fine. My point that I'm trying to say is that we often we begin with the how and haven't thought about the what. That's why in any good business plan, any normal business plan, begins with an executive summary, with a mission statement. What is your mission? What is your objective? Every paper we write, the first thing you learn, the ABC 101 of writing a paper. What is the purpose of this paper? So you say in the beginning, the purpose of this thesis, of this paper, this dissertation, is to achieve A, B, C. And then you begin saying how you're going to achieve it. I remember when I wrote Toward a Meaningful Life. So Toward a Meaningful Life, that's the title of the book. Every line of the book has to satisfy that promise. That in this book you will learn how to develop a life toward a meaningful life. So even though it sounds so obvious, I guarantee you, look at projects you do, very often you get stuck in the middle of a project, and then you say, why am I doing this in the first place? It's critical to understand the what before the how. The form follows the function. Function first, then form. You could say soul, body. But if you look at our lives, most of us work the other way around. I need to make a living. So we start, okay, what job should I find? And see what comes your way. Sometimes an opportunity comes your way. Sometimes you're lucky. Sometimes it's an accident. Suddenly you drop into this. And your life becomes to be defined from the outside in. Outside circumstances define who you are. And that's when you give people your business card. When they ask you, who are you? Here's my business card. How many of us really know how to work from the inside out? Here's my identity. I understand it well. And now I'm going to figure out my life. And that answers the question I asked earlier. Why did God create us in a way? Why not just make things a lot simpler? Instead of coming out of our mother's womb as little babies who are vulnerable and needy and weak and dependent, etc., and all that comes with that, let everybody be adults. Let babies be born adults. Like Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. It would seem so much more efficient. Parents could go right back to work once the baby is born. It's not a baby anymore. Baby can take care of itself. And you actually have in the animal kingdom, you have creatures like that. I think, I once saw, kangaroos, there are many, that within hours of when they pop out of their mother's womb, they're already on their own. Some are actually sent away. Other creatures doesn't work that way. There's a nurturing period. So the answer, one of the primary answers for this is because before entering a hostile world, if you'd come in as an adult, you would be unprepared. So the early years are formative years, from birth till the day when we leave our homes and we build our own lives. We're prepared, we are meant to prepare spiritually to find out who am I before I go out to change the world around me. So you may ask, okay, so then why Adam and Eve were not created as babies? Well, the answer is because they had no parents to teach them. One of the answers. There's a funny question they ask whether Adam and Eve had a navel. They call the Odom Arishna Gahata Pupik. You ever wondered this question? Why? Because you know a navel is a belly button, comes because of the umbilical cord. Now Adam and Eve were created by God without an umbilical cord. So the question is whether they had. So in Kabbalah it says Tabura de Adam Kadman, that they have a navel for other reasons. The point I'm making here is that part of the process of preparing a child to go into the material world is the education and the nurturing and the love that parents give. So God could have created a miracle. That you're 25 years old, you're born 25 years old, and you're already nurtured and educated and all ready to enter the world. But then, that defeats the whole purpose. The purpose of existence, as I said earlier, is V'shav Sa'aret Shabbos L'Hashem, to transform and recognize the inner forces that make this world be the spiritual forces. But that's something we have to recognize and learn. On the surface level, as I mentioned with the sea, teva, the word teva, nature, comes from the word tavu b'yamsuf, submerged. So when you look at the sea, you don't see much. You don't see anything. It's only now we know that the sea is more complex than earth. That same is with nature. When you look at nature, you can convince yourself it's a self-made world. But you think about it, you say, how could it be self-made? As I mentioned before, if every book testifies to an author and music testifies to a composer, this world, which is more beautiful and more artistic and more literary than any poetry, testifies to a creator. But you have to think about it. And it takes work. As a matter of fact, many people choose to deny it. Why? Because we grow up in environments where we worship and we become a product of the material world. And that's what we focus on, the sensory stimulation of an external universe. So that's why the pasuk begins and doesn't wait. It doesn't say, 6 years you shall work, sow the fields and prune the vineyards, and then the 7th year shall be Shemitah, Shabbos LaShem. The chapter begins immediately. When you come to the land, to the material world, the land, immediately know from day one, even before you pick up a pitchfork, even before you begin to touch the fields, know that the purpose of all of existence is Rishav Sar Shabbos LaShem. And then begins the process of the 6 years. Like I asked the question before, from the Kutei Torah, the question, why repeat it? Why begin Rishav Sar? Say, when you come to the land, 6 years you will work, and the 7th year you'll rest. Why begin and say, you come to the land, Rishav Sar Shabbos LaShem, you shall rest. You're not resting the first when you arrive. You have to work 6 years before you do. Because you begin right away with a form follows function. So right away we're told, what is the mission? You come to the land, don't start working. First know, why are you working? And this is like a critical component. If we all grew up in this way, before we became immersed in the material world, before we earned the first dollar of our lives, we were infused in knowing that the whole purpose of existence is not the surface, the 6 days of work, but the soul within it. What would the world look like? What would we look like? Look at the young children. They don't understand even the value of money. Some people see that as a deficiency. And I submit here that's not a deficiency, thank God. Why don't they see the value of money? If money is so powerful and so important, why don't 1 or 2, 3-year-olds see the value? As a matter of fact, the only way they learn the value is when they see their parents worshiping the golden calf. Why? Because it's not natural. Money is just a tool. It's a means. As important as it is, and the whole world runs, the money makes the world go around. And the Wall Street Journal is just a newspaper that sees everything through the lens of finance. And the New York Times it does as well, but it's just a little more masked in news. Why don't children who are natural creatures appreciate it? Why do they have to be taught? Because it's a superimposed reality. If you ask children what do they value, if they could speak, love, nurturing, truth, sincerity, all the qualities that, unfortunately, as we get older and start worshiping the outer world, become weaker and compromised. So children are born with that pure sense of enchantment, naive, fine, they don't know the world yet. And before they enter this material world, you're preparing them, and that's why God made it that way, that they should be trained and educated to know what the soul looks like before they learn about the body. Before they learn about a world of money and a world of business and a world of work, they should learn about the purpose of it all. Sadly, we adults have created the child's education, and we've teaching children to become material adults, when in truth it should be the other way around. So if you look at the Torah guidelines for education, you'll see it's all about focusing on the child's inner soul, how to serve God, how to find out what your mission in this world is about, the different obligations you have to make this world a moral place, a virtuous place. That's the focus. You're not teaching children how to build a career. Why? Because career is not the center of existence. That's a means. As I said before, we work from the inside out. First the what, then the how. To give children, for example, let's teach you how to use a hammer and a screwdriver and give them a whole tool chest. The question is, why do I have a tool chest in the first place? So the first focus in the first early formative years should be on understanding yourself. Then you can go out and find your soulmate. If you don't know your own soul, how could you find your soulmate? But sadly, we live in a world, and I can testify to this, you meet people, very good people, excellent people, but have no clue about this. Their lives are defined by what they do. And their lives become a sum total of their accomplishments, of their failures, of their achievements. It's not who they are. And if you ask, who are you? Most people have no clue. We have kinds of prerequisite answers. We could say, who am I? Yes, I'm a person who will find love in my life. I'm not suggesting there aren't some answers, but it's very weak, very not sophisticated. But what you do, we can talk about all day. I'll tell you what I do. I'll tell you about my business and my conquests and my achievements. We have a whole list. Who you are, which is, as you think about it, really should be the other way around. Who you are should identify what you do, not what you do should identify who you are. So this is very simple English if you want to understand what Judaism and Torah came to teach us. It was not to teach us what to do. Teach us who you are, and therefore what you do will be informed. As I said before, you go to a graphic designer, you go to a web developer, you go to anyone that's going to come and has to create a package for you. How will your message, your PR and marketing message to the world? The first thing they ask you is, what is the soul of your entity, of your business? What do you want to achieve? And they'll study it for months, if not whatever it takes, to understand what is it, the guts, the inner guts of what you want to accomplish. Because form follows function. First we need to know the soul of what you do, then we can build the body and say, okay, that's what you want to do. So now, here's how we will project it. We'll make this design, this logo, this marketing campaign, this distribution plan, etc., etc. When it comes to business, most people know this as business people. Why? Because it's again about the money. When it comes to our personal lives, most of us do not apply that same logic. Because, again, we become identified by the activities of this world, about the material world. So the Torah begins with Shav Sara Shabbos Lashem. The first thing you have to know is the purpose of your life, the mission of your life. And yes, it's more difficult to teach an adult than a child. Because if you teach it to a child who has a clean slate, a dry sponge, and they don't yet have preconceptions, then they grow up with a very basic foundation. So what are the first things we teach children in Jewish education, in Jewish Torah? We teach children the first thing, Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe. This is the Torah that God commanded Moses, that became inheritance by Rosh Kehilas Yaakov. We teach children Moda Ani. Every morning you wake up, remember you have a soul. Your soul was returned to you. You go through the list of the early education, and I'm not talking now mechanical. Think about the logic, the psychology. It's brilliant. You're basically teaching a child the purpose of his or her life. Whether it's through prayers or through mitzvahs or through how they dress. They should know that you're God's messenger to this world to bring light into a dark world. You're God's messenger to a material world that's a hostile universe, not to become part of it, but to transform it. And when that message is not conveyed, the child sadly will slowly become part of the world instead of part of the agent that changes the world. And it's a big, think about it, the consequences, the stakes are high. Give birth to a child, and it's in your hands as a parent to determine, are you going to give your child to learn about, to educate the child to learn about him or herself and her purpose in this world, and then let them enter the world with a set of tools that is directed from inside out, or you're just going to teach the child to become part of a material world and just another part of the problem instead of being part of the solution. You think about it, I'll just give an example. We live in a world, there's a lot of illness and disease. So many people who go study medicine and doctors feel, besides maybe the financial incentives, they also feel they want to be part of healing this world. What do you mean by healing it? That they learn medicine, they learn healing techniques. So once they become practicing physicians, people come to see them, they can help them build a healthier life. Physically healthier, psychologically healthier, a higher standard of living. So if there's disease, how to fight disease, how to strengthen the immune system, how to make healthier people. So it's a very altruistic vision. As I said, it also has financial benefits, so there's all the incentives there. Not everybody gravitates to becoming a doctor. You need to have certain a personality for that as well, etc. But I'm just giving you an example. Now let's talk about it from a Torah point of view. Think of it this way. Every one of us was given a mission to be somewhat of a spiritual doctor. What does that mean? That wherever you come, whoever you meet, you're there to help improve their lives. So if they even have a simple conversation, you can have a conversation with someone and it's a neutral thing. You'll leave the conversation just like you came in, nothing changed. You can have a conversation where you become more miserable after you speak to that person than before, less hopeful, more pessimistic. Or you have a conversation with someone and you leave that conversation feeling hopeful, optimistic, more confident. That is what we were sent to this world to be, sometimes called lamplighters. Ner Hashem nishmas adam. The flame of God is the soul of a human being. Ner mitzvah v'Torah are. Mitzvahs and Torah are compared to lamps and lights. And our goal is that when you meet someone, in some way to ignite some of their fire inside of them. Beautifully stated, very poetic, but also a real lesson in life. You take a cab, so you can say nothing to the cab driver, or you can say something kind. You never know. You're sitting there, somebody at a commute, you go to a party, you meet a stranger, a friend. Imagine thinking your life, wherever you meet, you have to ignite some little flame. Ignite a spark. Not the worst thing in the world to be a person like that. I'm not saying it necessarily for reward or just to feel good, but that's the role we play. Neiros lahoyer. To be a flame that illuminates and that warms other people. So ask yourself the question, when people come in your proximity, do they feel warmed, cold, or indifferent? There's three options. Like the guy that said, the pollster came to the guy and says he's taking a poll. Are you Democrat, Republican, or undecided? So he says, I think I'm undecided. Like the guy that says, I used to think I'm indecisive, now I'm not so sure. That's but that's also an option. That's also an option. So that's what life is about. If you want to use it in Kabbalistic terminology from the Mekubalim and the Hasidic masters, we are here to elevate sparks. Each of us is allocated a certain amount of Nitzutze Kedusha. Sparks. What are the sparks? So the Kabbalah Chassidus talks about Shviras HaKelim, that there was once an orderly world, then it was called Toihu, where this Kelim, the vessels, containers shattered. Not physically. Think of it metaphorically. And we're here to collect the pieces. So this material world is a very chaotic world. It's not an organized world in the sense everything is aligned towards divine purpose. There's a certain shattering, a certain fragmentation in our lives. And if you want to have a proof of that, just make a list tonight of everything you did today. And tell me how many things you can find connected. So our purpose in the world is to come into a fragmented world and bring Hashem Echad. The most basic of all liturgy, prayer in Judaism, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Echad. To reveal the divine unity in a fragmented universe. In all our ways we should know God. Not just when we do mitzvahs and Shabbos and Shemitah, but in all our ways. Even when you're walking down the street, even divrei reshus, things that are so-called neutral, that are up to you. Not a commandment and not a prohibition. You walk down the street. What you look like, how you behave. You're a walking agent of God's. Are you going to make a Kiddush Hashem? Or are you going to make, God forbid, the opposite? Are you going to sanctify God's name or desecrate God's name? Or neither? I always give the example. You come, let's say it's a hot day, you're very hungry, you pass by an apple tree. You happen to like apples. That's why some people I use apple tree, they say, hey, I don't like apples. So I say, okay, fine, call it a peach tree, a plum, whatever you want. It's like the difference between the Shlemiel, Shlemazel, and the Nudnik. The Shlemiel pours out soup on the Shlemazel's lap, and the Nudnik keeps asking, what kind of soup was it? So apple tree is not a must, it's just an analogy. You can use any tree that you like. Okay, comes an apple tree, and the apple is so juicy, you're hungry. So you have three options. You either can move on and ignore it. You could grab the apple off the tree and just indulge in your own hunger, and that's that. Or, as the Torah says, you take the apple sensitively off the tree. Make sure it's a proper food to you to eat, kosher and so on. All apples are kosher, but you get the idea. And you make a blessing on the apple. You don't just indulge. Why? Because the apple was created by God too. And it could be waiting there from the beginning of time for you to make a blessing on it. And thus be elevated. But if you indulge in it just for your own pleasure, so then the apple says, why did you rip me off a tree where I was living peacefully and never did anything against God, and you ate me like a glutton, and then use the energy to hurt somebody? Or you can take the apple and make the blessing and use the energy to help someone. Then the apple thanks you, metaphorically speaking. The spark has been elevated. That's an example. And we have thousands of examples like that through the day. Every day. People we meet, where we walk, how we act, what we eat. Every little act has that possibility. Now, if you don't teach children from young age this approach, of course, what are they going to become? They'll indulge, like everyone indulges. They see a world, I'm hungry, I want to eat. Just to use an example. So we say, no. A cup of water, Baruch Atah Hashem, you bless God, Shahakol Niyeh B'Dvarei. What does that mean? That everything was created through B'Dvarei, through His Word. You're teaching the child that in the water there's a spark. Lo Ya'alechem Levadeh, not on bread alone does man live, but Al Meitzah Pi Hashem, on the spark, or the Word of God that sustains the bread. You learn that there's something beneath the surface. Teva is a natural surface level that conceals, as I said, submerged, Tavu B'Yamsuf, everything beneath it. And you as a human being do not buy into that deception. And you say, no, there's some force behind it. And when I make the blessing, you reveal the spark within the food. I'm using food as an example. It includes even sleeping. How you go to sleep. Sleep is also an act. You can go to sleep in a holy way, in a serene way. You can go to sleep just like any animal. So we have a divine soul and an animal soul, and the battle rages every given moment. And that's why we begin with Shav Sarad. Before you enter the material world is a very powerful place. And remember, the Meraglim, who were the best of the nation of Israel, the scouts that Moses sent to Israel, who are they? They were the leaders of the tribes. As Rashi says, Ba'isishah, that time they were ksherim, they were all pure, they were all kosher. They go to Israel, this Israel that we read about, Kisove al Aretz, in this week's chapter, and what do they come back with? Terrible report. Israel, in 3 words, Eretz Echeles Yeshveh. It's a land that consumes its inhabitants. And they caused the whole nation to begin crying and mourning and grieving. Why are we going to such a land of giants? And they brought back these big fruits to demonstrate how powerful the land is. And we cannot conquer it. Only 2 people, Kalev and Yeshua, who had special strength. Moses prayed for him. Kalev went to the Maras HaMachpelah to get the strength from Chevron, from the patriarchs and matriarchs. They were the ones that said, it's not true. It's a challenging land, but Allah and Allah, we can go and we can conquer the land. And God gave us the strength and we should forge ahead. So what was the matter with the scouts? What happened to them? They were holy people. They were the greatest leaders. They were not Eizvavs. They weren't criminals. They didn't go with bad intentions. We know that. It says Kshayim Hayu. So what happened? What exactly happened? Why would they suddenly come back and say, God, who promised Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, and for hundreds of years, and they suffered 210 years in Egypt, all to go to the promised land. Suddenly, they saw the miracles in Egypt. They saw the parting of the sea. They saw the revelation at Sinai. The miracles through the 40, well, it's not 40 years because it was the beginning of the journey, but they saw miracles. Probably they even saw the man, the bread from heaven. Why suddenly are they doubting that you can go into the promised land? What do they want? What are we going to do here? They wanted to stay in the wilderness. So different commentaries, but the one that is probably most I don't say most, like easiest to understand is very simple. They were spiritual people. They saw a material world. They said, this is impossible for us to spiritualize this world. It's a land that consumes its inhabitants. I don't think there's a better 3 words to express Wall Street, the marketplace, and all the challenges of a business world. It consumes its inhabitants. You may enter it and say, I'm going to be better, I'm going to be more virtuous, I'm going to be kind, I'll be charitable. And you see man after man, woman after woman enters the business world and more or less becomes corrupt one way or another. I'm not going to say across the board. Obviously there are people that are not, and there's also measures and levels of it, but most people get compromised in some way. And yes, you need to have very high standards, and strong sense of purpose, and most importantly, an answering to a higher authority. Because why shouldn't you cheat a little if no one's going to catch you? Why shouldn't you be a little deceptive? Who are you answering to? I understand if the deterrent is being caught, and obviously there all the deterrent is the punishment. That's a good enough reason. But let's say you're not going to get caught. For every corporate scandal that has been caught, how many are not caught? Think about the percentages. The answer is only if you really know deep inside of you, v'shav sa'aretz, that the whole purpose of this work and this money is for a reason. It's not yours. It was given to you as a gift for a purpose. Well, the Meraglim saw this material world and they said, we don't want to go to Wall Street. We don't want to go to the marketplace. We want to stay in the kollel. We want to stay in the yeshiva, study, pray. Why do we have to impose on ourselves such a challenge where we doubt whether we'll be able to overcome it? So it was coming from a very pure place, actually, the argument. But their sin was no one asked you. God did not ask you whether we should go. God said, figure out how to go. And that was their sin. They stepped the boundary. They decided we can't do it. That would be like a soul telling God, I don't want to go down to earth because I can't conquer this world. The world is too corrupt for me. No one asked you whether. We asked you how. And al korcha chatachai, God commands, imposes, and what's the word for it? Coerces the soul to go down to earth, and that's the purpose. But when you go down, remember your purpose. Don't forget. That's not the land. When you come to the land, remember the purpose. So there's very good reason that we can avoid that. But that's the purpose of existence. So that's why the Torah says, and that's why we have an education that we begin v'shav sa'aretz Shabbos l'Hashem. When we begin our lives, it says kisavoy la'aretz. So yes, a soul comes out of its mother's womb, has now entered kisavoy, came to the land. Which land? The physical world. But it doesn't begin by working in the world. It begins first by slowly eating from nursing its mother's milk, slowly acclimating itself to a material world, step by step by step. And if done right, the education of the child will infuse it with such spiritual power that when it finally has to begin the 6 years of working the land, it is infused with v'shav sa'aretz, is infused with a mission, knowing that this whole world is created not for me to become part of it, but for it to become part of me. The world is a playing field for us to come and elevate it, not to become trapped by it. Like I said, the difference between you work from the inside out. First you define who you are before you figure out how to do things, what to do. First who you are and then what you do. Unfortunately, most of us begin with we know what to do, and that defines who we are. We become a product of our activities. So, what's the solution practically? Well, if it's young children, the solution is to make sure that not just mechanically, but you teach them from the youngest of age why they're here, what this world is created for, and that the day comes when they start facing this hostile world, they have enough tools to deal with it. For the rest of us that are already adults and we're already on the merry-go-round, flying at 90 miles an hour, obviously it's a little difficult to just stop it all. So you have to find oasi. We have to find little pockets to pause. That's why we have a Shabbos every seventh day. That's why we have a Shemitah every seventh year. To teach us, something. You're immersed in work. Take a day and discover this is the real purpose. And here there are two ways to do this. This is the Shammai Hillel argument I mentioned before. So the Talmud says that Shammai, when he motzah mana yafa, if he found a nice, beautiful piece of food, even on Sunday, he would set it aside and eat it for Shabbos. Fulfilling Zocher Shem Shabbos, that even on Sunday you have to remember Shabbos. Hillel said, Baruch Hashem Yem Yem, that every day God blesses us. So if you find a good piece of food on Sunday, make a blessing on it and eat it. Same on Monday, same on Tuesday. On Friday, you begin Misha Tarach Berev Shabbos, Yechel B'Shabbos. On Friday, you begin to prepare for Shabbos. So what's the essence of their disagreement? They both obviously kept Shabbos. They both remembered that the purpose of existence, even Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, is Shabbos. They both knew that for sure. So why did one do it in this way and one the other way? So let me maybe answer that with a story. They tell a story. It was Binyamin Kletzker was a chassid of the Balatanya Alter Rebbe. He was called Binyamin Kletzker because Kletzk is like a klotz, like he worked with wood. So they called him a man, the wood man. Okay, he was a businessman, but he was also a chassid and he was a Yireh Shamayim and dedicated. So, like any good businessman, he would make his accounting and he would write down, income expenses for the month of January, Tishrei, Cheshvan, Kislev. For every month, he had his calculations. And then when it came to the bottom, the sum total for the year, he wrote, instead of writing a number, he wrote, Ein Eid Milvade. There's nothing but God. So the question is asked, in other words, he realized the whole purpose of his business is not the wood, it's not the money, it's God. And the money has to be used for godly purposes, not just for selfish purposes. So the question is asked, if he was so saturated and permeated with that divine type of consciousness, then why on each line didn't he write? He should have written Tishrei instead of a number. He should have written God. Ein Eid Milvadeh on every line. Why only when it came to the bottom, the sum total, did he write it, and not on every line? So the answer is obvious, because if he wrote it on every line, he doesn't belong in business. He belongs in the yeshiva, maybe. The batlin. Because masa matam ba'amuna. According to the Torah, you do business, you have to do it ethically. You have business, you have investors, you have customers, you have clients, you have partners. You have to have a cheshbon, din v'cheshbon, an honest din v'cheshbon. Here's what the expenses, here's the income. But if you talk about the sum total of it all this is a means for godly purposes. Ein Eid Milvadeh, nothing but God. And here maybe we can explain the difference between Hillel and Shammai. Shammai, as I said, was more extremist than Hillel. Generally speaks, that Shammai was more severe. The famous story, let's say the potential convert comes to Shammai, teach me the entire Torah standing on one foot. So Shammai kicked him out, saying, that's ridiculous. You can't teach someone the Torah. The Torah is a big, complex work. Came to Hillel, and Hillel told him, Ada Olech Sani, what you dislike, don't do unto others. This is the entire Torah, the rest is commentary. Now Shammai and Hillel were both holy men. They were both sages. Shammai didn't know that. But Shammai demanded more. Like you find in the Talmud, you find Rabbi Gamliel, the Chacham, you find different arguments where they received students that are Teichei Kibar. There was some had a condition for a student to enter yeshiva. The inside and the outside have to be consistent. No hypocrites, in other words. And they were tested. So you can imagine, less students were accepted. Rabbi Gamliel said no. Even if a student is not Teichei Kibar, which means he's not completely consistent, his inside and outside are not exactly consistent, you still accept it. It says, in that day, how many more seats were added in the yeshiva? Because the standard was lower. So the question here too, who's right? The answer is, it's just two attitudes. One is a stricter attitude with higher standards. Shammai made that point. You need to know that as well. And Hillel took an approach, let's find a way in for him. So Mada'aluk Sani. But then he has to go study the Torah. Hillel was not trying to suggest that it's enough to study Torah standing on one foot. We know Hillel sacrificed his life to study Torah. There's no way he's suddenly saying the entire Torah is one law. You know the story, Hillel was a poor man, he couldn't study. He couldn't have money to enter the study hall, so he stayed up on the roof. Snow fell on him, he almost died, etc., etc. So Hillel was not, in other words, suggesting some easy way out to study Torah. You guide the mitzvah, so you have to study. But he was more lenient in general with an approach. He wants to begin on one foot. Let's start with that. And then, it'll lead him in. Mitzvah Gereres Mitzvah, it'll lead him in to study more and more. So the same thing here, Shammai and Hillel, two approaches to how you infuse the divine purpose of existence, Shabbos, V'shav Saras Lavos Hashem, into your life. Both of them know everything begins with Shabbos first. The intention of the existence of Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, and all your work is a higher purpose. That all your actions and all your ways, and we're not talking here about mitzvahs, we're talking here about your neutral ways, reshus, things that are not per se a commandment or a prohibition. So they both knew they were infused with the Shabbos mission. The question is now, when you actually come to the work of each day, How do you do it? So Hillel's approach was, in a sense, not as strict, or not as extreme, you can say. Some Sunday, yes, it's God's blessing. But Sunday, God also wants you to eat a meal. So eat the best meal for today to make the material world a spiritual place on Sunday. Shammai said no. Every day really is only a means toward the Shabbos, to the extent that you find a good piece of food, keep it, save it for Shabbos. So it's just an intensity of how much Shabbos permeates. They both agree that that's the purpose of existence. The question is how much. So Binyamin Kleska was a business person. Every day he had to calculate what he made, what he didn't make. So it would not be appropriate if he every day said today is Shabbos or today is Eid Milvadeh. But the sum total, he came to that. So you could say maybe Hillel was more like the businessman and Shammai was maybe more like the kollel man. So a person who's a ben Torah, in a sense, a Talmud Chacham, his basic involvement is not so much in work of the world. Even though scholars in the Talmud times always made sure they should not make an income from their Torah, they always had side jobs, so to speak, whether they chopped wood or they were water carriers or something like that, or they had a field. They found ways to make parnasa. But you can say Shammai was more immersed in that fashion. So therefore, a person like that is, in the weekdays, is not such a business person. So he was able to see Shabbos, and was supposed to see, Talmud Chacham Ikra Shabbos, so for even weekdays has a Shabbos-dik element. Hillel, on the other hand, was more immersed, so-called, and therefore saw that each day has to be elevated based on that day. And you can't say which is deeper. Each has a quality that the other doesn't have. Hillel's approach is that we need to permeate the world with the Shabbos spirit. Not just say everything is Shabbos-dik. The world needs to be transformed. And you have to work on the terms of the world. But then there are people who work the other way around. That's why it's a partnership. Yisachar Zvulun. Someone say, what's the purpose of existence? To be Yisachar, the scholars, or Zvulun, the business people? So we know they made a partnership where Zvulun said to Yisachar, I will support you, which is the basis of charity and tzedakah to yeshivas and so on. I will support your study, and I want credit for the study. Why do you need both? Because we live in a world where you need to be reminded. Number one, we need the purpose of transforming the world. That's what the business people do more. And not that the scholars don't have that, but they have it on a lesser level. And then you need the scholars that elevate the world to a Shabbos-dik level. Where when you're immersed in business, you may not have the time and the focus and the concentration. But the partnership is complete. And if you look in the pasuk where it says, Smach Zvulun b'tzeisecha, Yisachar ba'elecha, that's a blessing that Moses gives to the tribes before the end of his life. So it says, Smach Zvulun b'tzeisecha, starts with Zvulun. That Zvulun should be celebrating as they go out. What's tzeisecha? Going out of their home into the weekday, into the workday. And what's Yisachar ba'elecha? Yisachar spends inside, Ayelecha, in the tents, like it says, Yaakov is Yeshiv Ahalim. Yaakov is involved in the study. Esav was involved in being a warrior. Esav, in a holy way, would be being a warrior in order to transform the world. But you need both, and they both overlap. So in a sense, you could say that Hillel is more like a Zvulun b'tzeisech. When you go there, you need to do the business on ethical terms. You can't just not focus on your business. You need to focus, but you need to know that the purpose of it is Shabbos. And Shammai, let's call it more of a Yisachar ba'elecha. So every day when he found something that was a piece of food, he right away put it away for Shabbos. So there's different approaches in the extent of how much you permeate the material with the spiritual. But at the end of the day, no matter which opinion we follow, it's always V'shav Sa'aretz comes first. The education of our children. Even in our own lives, what's Bikurim? The mitzvah of Bikurim, another Kisaveh. Just like Kisaveh al-Aretz in this chapter, it says when you'll come to the land, it should be Shabbos Lashem, and then 6 years you shall sow the field and prune the vineyard, and then again Shabbos. The same thing later in Parsha Kisaveh, there's actually a chapter called, when you will enter the land, what does it say? You shall bring Bikurim. You shall bring the first fruit offering. What's the first fruit offering? The same idea. That when you plant a new field, besides just waiting after 6 years Shemitah, even right when you plant it, right away, the first fruit that emerge, you shouldn't consume. You give that as an offering in the temple. Which is a general rule. Bikurim comes also from the word BeHar, firstborn. So we see, in fruits, the first fruit, in children, the firstborn male, has a particular law, based on the story in Egypt and so on, Pidyon Haben and so on, of the first. You have even BeHar, Behema, BeHar Chamor, animals. The first animal that's born, if you own animals, livestock, also have to be redeemed. Because the first of everything, you have to focus and remember it's not yours. It belongs to God. And that then infuses the rest of what you have with godliness. You see it also in our day. When we wake up in the morning, what's the first breath? Your conscious breath, what should it say? Not get on a phone for a business meeting, not turn on the television, not a newspaper, not even take a shower. Moida ani lefanecha. It says, asum miyad, kishenir mishnasei. Immediately, as a person wakes up from sleep, immediately. That's the reason, by the way, we don't have Hashem's name in Modani, because you didn't even wash your hands yet. But immediately, what do you think of? God. That God just returned my soul to me. Why can't you wait 5 minutes? Because beginnings define everything. The beginning of everything. Even today in the houses of Congress, they begin with a prayer in the morning. A prayer before every session. Because when you begin with a mission. Then you get involved in the details. You could say in sports stadiums they start with a national anthem. I'm not going to compare it, but it's the same idea that you always focus on the purpose before you get into the function. Before you get to the form, you need to start with the function. First the tzura, then the chemer. First the soul, and then the body. So it's always the firstborn. And same thing here. They enter the land right away. No, the shafsars. The first thing you should know is the purpose. Then begins the actual steps. And you'll see this as a consistent theme in Judaism, that both in the beginning of something and at the end, you always bookend it and sandwich it with the purpose of it all. And even with that, we see how difficult it is to keep our heads above water and to remember. Leviticus Barditchev once made an announcement in the middle of a Tuesday in Barditchev, in his town, that all men, women, and children should gather to the shul. Okay. Everybody heard about Leviticus Barditchev says that, so there must be a decree in heaven, some gzeira in Shamayim, we got to abolish, whatever. And they closed the stores. Everybody came, men, women, and children, all packed in the shul. 3 o'clock exactly, the dot of Yitzchak Barditchev comes out, and he bangs on the bimah like this and says, I want everyone to know that there's a God in this world. There's a Rabbeinu Shleilim in the Welt. I want you to know there's a God in this world. And that was it. And he left. And that's the punchline, by the way. That's the story. I know people always wonder, so what? Well, that's the what. Why do you have to remind them? Because that's how it is. We live in a material world. And as many reminders as we have, it's still not enough. Someone said to me once, why are there 613 mitzvahs? There's so many. So I said, they're not, as you could ask why there's so many, there's so little. Based on how many distractions we have, and based on how we're immersed, even with 613 mitzvahs, we got problems. Because we live in a world where God created an agnostic universe. He concealed it exactly like Teva. Like the sea conceals everything underneath it, nature conceals. You look around, you can be distracted, and you can forget there's a God. So it's something that has to be remembered. So the Torah says, I give you first, children will be born to you. Kisavei al-aretz, as soon as they come to this earth. Remember, in their mother's womb, they learn their entire Torah. That's what's happening, by the way, Rachel, to you, right? So the best yeshiva of all is a mother's womb. Because it's not based on any schools and boards and committees and bureaucracies and corruption. The best yeshiva is 9 months when you spend in the mother's womb. You're learning Torah straight from an angel of God in the purest way. No politics. What do you think about that? So we all begin with a very good schooling. But then consciously we're made to forget. As the Talmud says, the angel comes and makes shh. That's why we have a cleft over our lip. And we forget, consciously. But it still remains embedded in us. Now the child emerges into this world. And it's up to us parents. First thing is, Kisavei al-aretz, teach the child about its soul. Remind it about what it learned in its mother's womb. So when it grows up and finally enters into a world that's not so divine, it will be strongly armed and have everything it needs in its arsenal to fight the battle. That's the healthiest approach. Now that would be like the fundamental foundation to any education. An education that's infused with that. Teaches children who you are, what kind of soul you have, what strength you have, the tools you have, confidence, self-esteem, the whole works. Imagine what the world would look like if children were educated one after the other like that. Unfortunately, as I said, it's not always it doesn't work out usually that way, either because parents themselves don't know or they don't do the job right. So now children are adults, and now we have to sometimes begin as adults to think this way. So that's why we have Shabbos, we have Shemitah, we have all these reminders that tell us to recalibrate our mindsets, to focus on what matters. Now, obviously, as I said, when you're in the rush hour, in the rat race, it's very difficult to just stop. But we must do that. There's no other way. We don't have to wait for a crisis, God forbid. Because when crisis comes, when your business fails or something else doesn't work, God forbid, then suddenly you wake up and say, you know what, what's your priorities? We don't have to wait for that. So the Torah teaches us, as I said, Modani, or the beginning of a year, Rosh Hashanah. Why the beginning of the year? Because when you start something new, you start with a new bang, with a new enthusiasm, with a new sense of hope. It's like a new leaf. You turn a new leaf. It's a new chapter. Rosh Chodesh, new month, a new week. All these things give us hope. A new day. Modani, as I said. All about starting right. So V'shavsa, as soon as you come Savei La'aretz, whether it's every morning when you wake up, or Kisavei La'aretz every year when the new year begins, or every month, or the birth of a child, all these should be infused immediately with V'shavsa, with the soulful cognizance and consciousness, which is the force that will allow what you do be defined by who you are. So, in this final analysis, when asked the question, do we live to work, or do we work to live? I think the answer is quite obvious. Most of us live to work, unfortunately, because work takes over. It's the predominant amount of time that we spend is work. So we live to work. Wake up in the morning, work. I go to sleep early so I can get to work the next day. Everything orbits around work. The Europeans like to say Americans live to work and they work to live. The question is what their living is like. It's another discussion. But what does it mean to work to live? Work to live means work is a job. God sent your soul to this earth. Sheish shanim taseh malachtach. Sheish shanim tizeh sedecha. Or sheish shanim yomim taseh malachtach. 6 days you shall do your work. 6 years you shall sow the land. All for a purpose. To spiritualize it and to refine it and turn it into a mishkan. V'shachanti b'seicha. To take the material world and turn it into mishkan. It's a very different approach. So two people could be working. One thinks work is the end and they live to work, and the other person knows work is a means. It's a purpose. You were sent there. It's a mission. It's your mission. And never forget that Shabbos is the center of it all. And that's what I just said is a fundamental difference. It's not just a nice different wording whether you work to live or live to work. Work to live means that the inner you defines yourself, not what you do, not your activities. So I hope some of these words will help us all somewhat refocus and not wait, as I said, for a crack or a break to have to do that, and take this message personally. It's a tremendous lesson in life on all levels, whether, as I said, children, ourselves, focus. And you'll see almost every self-help type of program, every spiritual exercise, yogas, whatever it is, all come down to this point. To get out of the rat race, to get out of that whole rush hour and create space. Create some spiritual space, create some peace. And we have it, the original Shabbos. What was Shabbos? Shabbos and Menucha. A day, an oasis in time that allows you to focus on the inner life instead of the outer life. Not to escape it, but to go back to it with a new energy, recharged batteries. So maybe everyone have a very Shabbos-dika week, whether it's the Shammai style or the Hillel style, but never forget the purpose of everything that you're here for. And it's not easy because we get stuck in the means and we think that's the end. It should be a Shabbos-dika week in the spiritual sense of the word. One of the Chassidim once came to the Frierdiker Rebbe, and it was the middle of the week, and he said, Rebbe, I'd like you to say a Maimer Chassidus. A Maimer Chassidus was a formal Chassidic discourse. And the Rebbe says, I only say Chassidus discourse on Shabbos. So this man said, when I come to you, the Rebbe, it's Shabbos for me. And the Rebbe went and dressed up for this and said the discourse. So Shabbos is the physical day of Shabbos. There's also a spiritual sense. There are times when you have a moment in the week where you could say it's a Shabbos-dika moment. It's a moment that lifts you up to another time and space. Obviously not halachically in the technical sense of it, but in the spirit of it. And we say when Mashiach will come, will be Yom Shekulei Shabbos U'Menucha L'Chai Olam. The whole world, all the time, will be Shabbosdik. And of course, then Shabbos b'Shabbate, Shabbos will be on a higher level than that. So maybe everyone have this type of infusion of Shabbos in your life, and not just, I don't mean that just in the sense of sleeping late and eating shont. Today, some people follow Shammai, they're already eating shont on Sunday and Monday, Tuesday. It's the opposite actually. Shammai put it away for Shabbos. They're bringing the Shabbos into Sunday. Someone said, I live Shabbos 7 days a week. Comes up from Yerushalayim, right? They've mastered that art? No? Only from Wednesday? Oh, okay. Yeah. Today there's mikvahs, you go to the mikvah, there's a chunk waiting for you right outside, so it's all taken care of. It's a Tayamel Chaim Zah, it's a taste of the Geula. Anyway, so everyone should have this type of week, a good week, a pleasant week, a week of simchas and joy, and only good news. And until next Wednesday, Philip, who's my dear colleague and student for so many years, what do we call him, the spiritual boogie-woogie mystic, something like that, gives his Thursday night class. I encourage you to contact our office to find out more details. It's a very mysterious class. We all never know exactly where it is, but if you contact us, we can let you know. I know people like mysteries, and this class, on the other hand, is right here and online, of course. And please stay in touch if we can be of any help. And of course, I should mention the Omer book. We're now in the Omer season, 49 days between Passover and Shavuos. So if you want, we have an Omer app at myomer.org. You can download a free app, as well as get a daily email reminder. Just send us an email at meaningfullife.com, our website. And until next Wednesday, it was an honor and pleasure to share a few words. Thank you.